Welcome back to Tanya in 5. Today, we recap letter 6 in the Iggeret HaKodesh. In this letter, the Alter Rebbe explains how giving charity is the means by which we can reach and experience the transcendent. You see, in one's connection with God, an emotional attachment to God, there are two modes by which this can be experienced. The first is by one understanding as much as they can about the greatness of God, appreciating God, the beauty of it, the grandeur of it, and in this way coming to feel a love and awe of God. The second is if God were to gift us, to grant us on His terms feelings of love and awe and attachment to Him. Now obviously, that which God would grant to us is far greater than that which we could experience by creating our own attachment to God. Now, not simply because God is on a, quote, higher level than us, but because fundamentally the truth of God is beyond any truth we can possibly experience. You see, all created beings are not inherent realities. They are realities that truly exist, but their truth of existence is dependent on exterior factors. They need time, they need space to exist, air, atmosphere. There are all kinds of conditions that are necessary for anything to exist. So everything that exists, it's truly here, but its truth is not absolute. Its truth is dependent. And most fundamentally, it's dependent on God to exist. But God's truth, by contrast, is not, God forbid, dependent on anything. It's not a circumstantial truth. It's an absolute truth. God exists simply because He exists, not because it requires any conditions, God forbid, and not because there are other things around that allow for God to exist. He just exists. His truth is absolute. Whereas the truth of all created beings are conditional truths, or circumstantial truths, truths that are dependent on the circumstances that allow them to be as they are. So how is it possible for a human being to invoke from God that God grant them an experience of love and fear on His terms? We can see how we might develop our own love and fear based on the circumstances of our existence. But how are we supposed to invoke from God that He grant us love and fear of Him on His terms, at His level of truth? The truth is, we get this by thinking about this very concept. When we understand that God is transcendent, absolute, true, and unchanging, because He is not a circumstantial being, He is an inherent and absolute being, then we can appreciate the descent that our soul goes through. Our soul comes from that absolute true place, one with God. And here now is descent into a place and a world of division, a world of circumstance, and in a body that's capable of sinning. Even if I never sin, the very fact that my body in this life is capable of sinning is in and of itself the greatest descent and the greatest belittlement of the soul, which comes from the lofty, transcendent, absolute truth of God. And therefore, one would feel a great sense of compassion on the soul. Poor soul, stuck in a body like mine. This, in turn, invokes the source of that soul, God Himself, to invest within us some sort of experience of that transcendence, a love and a fear and an attachment to God on this transcendent terms of God's truth. But this too is not enough, because the feelings of compassion we might feel in our soul for its descent is in and of itself defined by my human experience, and therefore fails to really reach the transcendence. So what do? Says the Alter Rebbe, this is where charity comes in. When a person gives charity, a person takes from that which they have and gives it to somebody else who does not. then God too responds and takes that which He has and gives to us that which we don't have. An attachment to Him on His terms, something that on our own we can never achieve. The takeaway from all of this is, charity is not to be limited to when we feel like we want to give charity, when we feel like the person who we are giving to deserves our charity, when we feel comfortable, when we are in the mood, and so on. If we're to do that, then when God decides to give us, He might make the same calculation. Am I worthy of receiving God's grace? I'm not so sure I want God to make that calculation. And therefore, when I give charity, I give simply because somebody else here doesn't have, and I do, I give. And then God responds in the same way. Here's a Jew which doesn't have, God does, God gives. And not just material blessing, but as we learned here, even spiritual blessing. A deep and true connection to God, a love and fear and attachment to God on God's terms, beyond that which we can ever possibly achieve. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude Letter 7.